to today's session. Before we start, I'll do an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge Madam's situation on the Wajir Nuga land and that Wajir Nuga people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of the land, continuing to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. Those joining remotely are invited to acknowledge their respect for the Indigenous people of the lands on which we sit and pay their respect to the elders past, present, and future. Our first presenter today is John Godfrey, and he's going to talk about empirical theorizations of global philanthropy.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. That's actually a slightly clumsy title, and it probably isn't exactly accurate, nor is the abstract. So I just want to make a couple of comments. I think rather than critiques, I'm talking about discourses. And rather than empirical theorizations, I'm not even sure if such a thing exists, I'm talking about some of the theoretical lenses that have been applied specifically to empirical research into elite philanthropy. And it's that aspect. Empirical research is what I and Alex, because this began with a project that I did with Alex Williamson, are particularly interested in. So what Alex and I did was a scoping review of the existing empirical research into elite philanthropy. And one of the motivations, and I have to sort of declare my particular interest and potentially bias in this particular area, because I am a professional fundraiser and I spend a lot of time talking to elite philanthropists. And elite, I won't go too much into the definition, but largely people of wealth and power. But we find ourselves, or the public is assailed by publications like this or comments in the popular press that, as Beth Breeze points out and describes as hyper-criticism, are actually damaging and dangerous to the concept of philanthropy, and particularly the philanthropy of the very wealthy. So that's my motivation. And we did a scoping study, and this particular paper, which is a conference paper, it's something in development, is looking at the critical lenses that are applied to this, and some of which are reflected in those titles I showed previously. And those titles which I showed previously are written by and based on completely non-empirical pretexts. So when we look at the empirical data, I borrowed from a paper that was written by these two Canadians, Lefebvre and Fontaine, which was actually focusing on philanthropic foundations rather than the personal philanthropy of elites. Mostly, although some elites have set up foundations, but the bulk of foundations studied by Lefebvre and Fontaine, and most people, including Alex, who have done research in foundations, are foundations that no longer are run by family members and have professional administrators. But I found that these were the three categories which Lefebvre and Fontaine applied to their review of the foundation literature, and I took that as a starting point. And interestingly, I didn't find in the time that I had available and using the methodology I had to conduct these reviews any particular reason to change from those. I did change the names a little bit, and I'll come to the social relationship, which is the one I changed. They had a different title for it. But effectively, or essentially, these are the main kind of theorists who conform with those particular groups. Obviously, Marx and Gramsci, because that's in the title, but then Veblen, Fulton Veblen feeds into some of the theorizing around that's applied by the group of authors whom I'll come to on another slide. What Lefebvre and Fontaine called the classical liberal approach or lens, very much draws on Adam Smith's discussion and discourse and theories around philanthropy, and Andrew Carnegie's. And the social relationships, the term social relationships I've drawn from actually a paper by Paul Shervish and Susan Ostrander, which Lefebvre and Fontaine acknowledge. But it's also theorists like de Tocqueville, who wrote a sort of classic study of community organizations in the US, in contrast to France, 18th century France, where he came, where it was all very top down. And Emile Durkheim, who looked at, obviously, applied a sociological lens to philanthropy and other concerns, other social concerns in 19th century France. So those are the three kind of groups or approaches, theoretical approaches, that I used when I began to start to look through the research, and these are the kind of factors that are highlighted by these three approaches. So I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new when I explain that the Marxist Gramscians focus very much on class or caste, on inequities in society. There's a discourse around how elite philanthropy is largely based on the preservation of the interests of the elites. There's a lot of discussion about hegemony, particularly Gramsci, whose prison diaries very much look at the bourgeois hegemony and how perhaps to use that to improve the lot of the working classes. But in his case, it was very much a vertical hegemony, and we can talk about Foucault, who kind of broke that up a little bit later. And Kapoor, who is obviously a contemporary theorist who, amongst other things, coined this idea of decaf capitalism. It's kind of, in Australian parlance, that would probably be Clayton's capitalism or Clayton's philanthropy, where, it's the philanthropy you have when you're not really wanting to change anything. It's that kind of cosmetic philanthropy in their terms, not mine. And then the classic liberal school or discourse, Lefebvre and Fontaine themselves described it as hagiographic. So a lot of the scholars who've written in that area, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later, kind of, are very hagiographic about it. It's the kind of, this is the best form of philanthropy. This philanthropy, it's the sort of big man approach to philanthropy, and it is very much the big man approach to philanthropy, but these are shining lights doing wonderful things. Mostly Zoltan X in particular talks about entrepreneurs and or business people, and similarly to Bishop and Green, who coined this phrase philanthrocapitalism, their notion is that entrepreneurs, business people, people who've worked in finance are especially acute and skilled at philanthropy because they're applying those kinds of business skills to philanthropy. And that's obviously a fairly hagiographic approach. And then finally, what I've described as the social relationships lens to philanthropy, what that tends to bring attention to is that philanthropists, that there are values and there are norms that motivate philanthropists. They're not doing it for self-aggrandizement. They're not doing it, purely because they're business people and think that they can change the world through business practices. It looks at philanthropists through an agentic lens. Some of the analysis they have done has been looking at philanthropy, elite philanthropy, by applying a typological approach. And there's one area where this particular school of thought and Paul Shervish come almost around in a circle, and that's the notion of, applied in two quite different ways, the accusation that philanthropists are acting in their own self-interest, and what Paul Shervish explains as, drawing on Aristotle, philanthropists give or show an interest and contribute to what's close to them, but that is actually an act of Aristotelian philia. You start with what is close to you. You give to your own friends, family, and community. But he does point out, and in this sense, he does coincide with people like Ostrander and Ostro, whom we'll come to on the next slide, Odendal, I should say. He does, through his research, or through his and colleagues' research, confirm that a lot of elite philanthropy is what he calls consumption philanthropy, and what Odendal, I haven't got my notes unfortunately, but Odendal, in the first sentence of her study of elite philanthropy in the United States, points out that most philanthropists actually give to causes that are close to them. And she applies that in a very pejorative way, whereas Shervish, as it were, ennobles that. So some of the other names associated with this particular Marxist-Gramscian approach are Odendal and Francia Stroh, who wrote around about the same time. Francia Stroh focused on New York philanthropists. Odendal's was slightly wider. It looked at the US elite and how they sponsored or funded things. And they were largely, in their view, sponsoring or funding things like universities, the Ivy League universities, the elite arts, health, prestigious hospitals and so on, that were kind of close to their interests. Lindsay McGoey's research is largely focused on Bill Gates and George Soros, and very much on the kind of, she doesn't cite Kapoor, but it's very much around, just scrolling through my notes, she talks in terms of the power asymmetry, and the suggestion that philanthropists have ulterior motives. They're being philanthropic because it benefits them. Kapoor, as I said, Kapoor, whom I'm now coming to, follows Zizek's notion that capitalists are kind of creating a false imaginary around they are doing good, whereas in reality, the real, in Zizek's terminology, is that they're not actually challenging or changing anything in society that's going to really have an impact or overcome inequities or poverties or other things. Jessica Sclair and Teresa Coldover are both interesting in that everyone I've spoken about so far has really only looked at US philanthropy. So these are two people applying the same lens, pretty much. They're still pretty left-wing. But Jessica Clare looked at Brazil and how some of the old families in Brazil adopt this kind of Zizekian approach. You know, they talk about doing good, but they're not really, because they make their money from, according to her studies, from not challenging the status quo, but they nonetheless are philanthropic. Teresa Cordova looks at Russia, which is somewhat different, slightly different, but there's this whole new class of oligarchs who practice philanthropy, but of course they're not really challenging the orthodoxy or the new orthodoxy because they've become oligarchs because of the current regime in Russia. So that's the Marxist-Gramscian critique or discourse. Then we come to this that Fontana and Lefebvre referred to as hagiographic. The term philanthropic capitalism was coined by these two One's a journalist, one's an economist, wrote a very highly cited book. I mean, almost everybody who writes in this area talks about philanthrocapitalism, which was the phrase they coined in the title of their book. Zoltan Axe, who particularly focused, and others who co-authors over time, particularly focused on how entrepreneurs were particularly oriented towards types of philanthropic practice that draw on their entrepreneurial skills. So those are both largely US, although Bishop and Green did undertake a reasonably global survey. It looked at Indian philanthropy and European philanthropists and so on. Harvey, Shaw, Gordon and McLean are British researchers, but they tend to focus very much again on entrepreneurs. That's their area of interest. And Rob John, Roger Davis and Louise Mitchell looked at, in 2 different studies, City of London financiers and their philanthropic approach. The interesting thing about particularly these last 2 is they do tend to look at how those London philanthropists collaborate, and also tend to, some of them are focusing on, for some of their philanthropy is directed at global issues, but also some of their philanthropy is directed at local issues. And then there's a whole lot of other people who, again, starting to think about things other than just the US or the UK. So there's been some work done by a researcher called Holmes on Chile, a researcher called Carrillo on a number of researchers that looked at Chinese philanthropy, but again through this entrepreneurial lens. Shim Fossil has done another study of Russia, and all of them, though, have applied the kind of philanthrocapitalist lens to these areas of research. So then finally, the third focus or approach is this one, which is really related to the fact that philanthropy emerges because even wealthy people are involved in society, involved in relationships, or involved in community. They have particularly the emphasis that emerges out of Shervish's and his colleagues' work is that they have agency and they have a sense of identification with others, and they're driven by moral values and beliefs, sometimes, often, based on their kind of religious backgrounds or religious precepts. So Shervish kind of has developed 2 kind of ways of looking at elite philanthropy. One is by creating a topology, and the other is by creating a model or a theoretical model or theoretical construct, which is very much based on identity, values, learning from your parents about being philanthropic, learning from and working with and influencing your peers. Much more of a kind of humanist approach to philanthropy. And that the probably best known topology for many people who work in the area of philanthropy, and particularly in fundraising, as I do, is a work by Russ Prince and Carol File called The 7 Faces of Philanthropy, which kind of identifies 7 patterns, 7 ways in which philanthropists behave. But I won't itemize them, but I will say that they are all to do with agency, social interaction, relationships, and in some degree kind of moral and value-driven motivations. And those have been echoed here in Australia and in the UK. In the UK by Teresa Lloyd and Beth Breeze, and a lot of the work done by people like Wendy, Alex here, Katie McDonald, Susan Smiley up at QUT, echo and draw on a lot of Shervish's in particular. Lloyd and Breeze's work and identify those same patterns in Australian philanthropy. So I think we're just about on the last slide. Where would I like to go with this work? I think there's potentially room to look at or look beyond or break out those three categories. I'm wondering whether kind of deeper drill down into the literature using tools like, for example, Lexi Manson might throw something else up. The work I've looked at so far didn't look at any experimental or psychological work in this area. It's largely ethnography and anthropology and sociological approaches, and glaringly lacking. As much as I say there's not very much international research done, there's the beginnings of some, as we saw in Russia, China, India, and other places, but none of it reflects any indigenous lenses. And that, I think in time, I hope in time, will throw out all sorts of other different notions, concepts, discourses about philanthropy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for finishing on time, John.
Thank you, but I didn't see the three in the, but I said the last one.
Our next presenter is Alex, and she's going to be talking about 2 decades of giving data. What have we learned? And it's a study that has been co-authored by with Miles and Mary.
You in the eyes. I'm going to have to move around the room so I can find this one. I'm standing right in front of the slide.
Maybe down here.
Thank you. That's better. That's a tough act to follow, John, but I'll do my best. As I said, as Ushi just introduced, this is a paper in progress again with my esteemed colleagues, Mari Balsam, who is our data cruncher, and of course, Professor Miles McGregor-Lowndes. He's our emeritus professor. He is nominally retired, but in practice, he nevertheless immensely enjoys his ongoing involvement, and we are very grateful for it. I'd like to start though by acknowledging the traditional owners of QUT, where this work was done. In QUT, that's the Charitable and the Ghoorah people. Here in WA, it's the Whadjuk and the Noongar lands. First Nations owners of the lands, and we pay our respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, recognising that these places have always been sites, locations of teaching, research, and learning, and indeed the important contribution that they make to the university communities. So a brief overview to begin with. What this paper looks at is the data from the ATO that is made available each year, and it has now been available and has been analysed by researchers at ACPNS for 2 decades, in fact just over. The data that was available earlier this year and was analysed was the 21st year. So each year ACPNS produces a report. It's generally around 100 pages of analysis of that data of giving by individuals that goes to deductible gift recipient organisations and is subsequently claimed by those individuals in their tax returns. And come back to that later when I talk about limitations, and there are some very important ones. But it is nevertheless true that there is a bigger and different story to tell from this data when we look at it over those 2 decades, rather than each year's data being analysed as an individual year to try and tease out what's happening right in the most recent data that we have available. So what I'm presenting here isn't, it is purely descriptive statistics. We're not trying to do regression analyses here. We are actually doing those separately, not with this exact data though. To do that, we need the what's called the 2% data, which comes out from the ATO each year as well. And that offers a slice of data anonymised, but whereby you can actually track individual returns. What's presented by the ATO in terms of donations isn't that. It isn't individualised, so you can't use it to do the regression analysis and things. But we can have 2 decades of data which tells a quite a fascinating story, I think, over 2 decades for us. So what we've done for this paper is to look at 3 key topics. So we're talking about the percentage of taxpayers who donate at any level at all. So they could claim the $2, that is classic donations of $2 and over a tax deductible, all the way up to those who give multi-millions. We're looking at the average amount of donations, and we're looking at their donations as a percentage of their income. So those are the 3 topics that I'm going to be walking through in this presentation. But then for each of those, we're looking at those through the lenses of the age, the gender, the income level, and the state of residence of that donor. Okay. So I think what's really important in this data and in this story is that it's about donors at all levels of giving. So the paper that John just presented and the work that I've done in collaboration with John in a literature review paper is looking specifically at elite donors. But what I love about this data is that we pick up the smallest of the donations, the people who earn very little by our standards, who are in the lowest possible tax bracket. Some of them submit tax returns even though they're under that $18,000 threshold of income. So that's the value, I think, of this, is that it gives us that broad picture. It's not just about the mega donors, the ultra high net worth, the ones who set up foundations. This is the full story, or the biggest possible story that we can tell. And that's why I love this data. I'm really, really passionately fond of this stuff. But I think there are the other reasons, the other motivations for this is that when we talk about, and it's been a bit of a theme starting last night with the dinner and the presentation by Kate Cheney, but going through today, this morning's presentations as well, is that we often, when we think about funding for third sector research organisations, it's generally about government funding through service provision contracts. When we're looking at philanthropic foundation giving, it's often at the project level. And then we look at the major gifts, the big gifts from the big donors, and those that have the potential through their size to shift to charity missions. So those tend to be the things that we focus on as researchers. But I think it's these small mass donations that are the ones that give third sector organisations the ability and the discretion to do with those funds as they will. And that's really, really important, but we don't know as much about these funders, these donors. It's not a uniform picture over those 2 decades because more and more data has slowly become available. For example, we didn't originally have giving by residential postcode, but by occupation. And we've also gained data on the median gift as well as the average gift. And again, that's vitally important because it's another measure of centrality in our data. Instead of telling us the sort of the average gift, which can be skewed quite significantly by mega gifts, the median tells us what's really going on for your average person, your typical donor. And of course, we can track some of the major environmental, social, external events, economic ones in that data. The GFC in particular is quite familiar. So what the data actually includes is all individual taxpayers from the 1999-2000 year through to the 2019 and 2020. As with Anna's discussion, there are limits on this data. They only include those who submitted tax returns before 31st of October of the subsequent year. So that's the deadline for individual submission of tax returns. So for example, the current year, the 2019-20, which is the most recent data, is those who submitted a tax return before the 31st of October 2020. I'm going to talk later, as I said, about the limitations to this data, but it's easy to overlook the fact that it's a huge amount of data. So we have data from 15 million Australians for 2019-20, and that is remarkable. It's remarkable internationally as well because, for example, in the US, we so often get compared with the US in terms of our giving and our philanthropy. But they in the US can submit income tax returns as a household or as a couple. And so when you speak to US researchers and you casually drop into conversation that, you know, because our giving data is done at an individual level, we can look at gender, we can look at occupation, we can look at residential postcode, and they kind of go this pale green colour, which is fabulous, because they can't disaggregate by those things. And so the picture we can tell is much more nuanced and detailed. So there's a lot of graphs, I'm sorry about this. What I've tried to do is to keep them simple. I have a heap of notes to go with some of these slides, but in the interest of getting through them, I'll try and sort of perhaps answer questions later. They're reasonably, I hope, self-explanatory. You can see in the first that the percentage of taxpayers who donate at all has gone up and down. This was a little gap in the data where the question about donations was dropped off your tax return form, and then thankfully it came back on again. There's this funny little blip in the data, which is sort of the late 80s, early 90s. So as you can see, the number of taxpayers who's donating has actually fallen quite significantly since about 2009. It spiked up just a tiny bit in 2019, 2020. We assume that's the effect of the bushfires in particular, because COVID, you know, was taking hold quite severely, but I think in the middle of 2020, none of us had the faintest idea how long it was going to go for or what the impact was going to be. So I think and it's pure hunch, but I suspect that uptick in 2020 was more about the bushfires than not. Certainly charities received more grants at that point, but not all of those donations necessarily came from individuals. So that's the difference you have to appreciate here. The average amount of being donated is going up quite dramatically, but the average fell. And this story here that we see a decline in the last sort of decade, a little over, in the number of taxpayers who are donating, but the increase in the average amount being donated. So fewer people are giving and claiming, but they're giving more. That's a global picture, or at least in Western countries. So it holds true in Canada, it holds true in the US, it holds true in the UK, it holds true in the rest of Europe. So the picture that we're seeing here, I'm now going to try and break down a little bit more for you. So this slide, we're looking at gender. A couple of interesting things here. Firstly, women give more women give than men. And that is absolutely true, absolutely consistent, doesn't shift. The percentage of their taxable income, more women give more than the men do. The male line jumps around more than the women's does. We don't really understand why. We're trying to tease that out a little bit more through some of the regression analyses in the data that I mentioned at the start. That's not something that I'm covering today. This slide starts to look at age groups and say, the first one is, all those who do give, what's the age differential between them? So you would sort of expect that younger people are going to give less. They have less probably, they sense they have less capacity to give. They're certainly earning less. That will come to income in a minute. What's quite clear though is the 45 to 59 age group are our significant band of donors by age. And then when you come to the amount of their income that they're giving, again, it's the 60 pluses who absolutely are the stars there. So they're sort of, there's clear daylight between them and then the next group, which again goes down by age. So there's some fairly sort of consistent patterns there. We don't really understand what happened in 2015-16. Why is that sort of zigzag in the orange line in that second graph? But we can, and I'll show you that later, it was also visible in a particular income band as well as an age group. So this is where we start to look at the data by income band. There's not much of a story to tell here other than that the decline in the percentage giving is not affected by income band. It's happening across all income bands. So we can't say it's those with high incomes who are giving less. We can't say it's those on the lowest income who are giving less. It's across the board. And that's the story that you need to take away from that. Okay, for this one, we've got everybody who's earning less than $1 million on this slide, everyone who's earning more than a million on the far side. We had to split them out because the axes, the y-axis, was just so divergent that when we tried to plot the whole thing on one graph, it was just impossible. This was all just one sort of multicolored rainbow blob at the bottom. So we broke it out there. Again, we've got this funny spike happening around sort of 2017, 16 in the numbers there in that red line, which is your $250,000 to $500,000 of income. And again, you would sort of roughly expect that as your income band goes up, your average gift is going to go up. That's reasonably predictable, and that's what we see there. What I find interesting here again is this real jumping around and the average gift by those with an income of 1 million per annum and over. I think this is worth remembering. This isn't assets, this is income. So these are people who are earning, by standards of our society, enormous amounts of money. But we don't really understand quite why that line is going around, moving around quite so much. Interestingly, that highest income band, that fell in 2019, 2020. So despite the fact that there was a reversal in that little kink in the line that we saw in the earlier slide, it wasn't the high income donors. Okay, do you get fed up with graphs yet, everybody?
No.
No. All right, so again, we have a fairly consistent picture at the bottom of the graph here. There's a bit of jumping around in this green line. That's our 250 to 500 on this graph. We've got a bit of a funny dip going on, something with the people who are earning in terms of their income the least here. So those two lines do this weird crossover thing. Again, 2017-18, something weird went on there. We haven't really been able to figure out quite what it was. But again, the top line there is our $1 million or over income donors. And again, that sort of drop in 2019-20, which doesn't reflect the overall picture. Okay, now we're looking at this breakdown, and again, we'll come back to the percentage of taxpayers who are giving by state and territory. Northern Territory, something weird went on there, but that's a far smaller number of donors. That's the smallest number for any of the states and territories. So again, that could be skewed a little bit. They sort of have that rise there. But the overall picture, again, a declining number of taxpayers across Australia. And I will talk a little bit more in my very final slide about that one, what we think might be going on there. Okay, this one's an interesting one. Well, here we are in Perth. And WA does some really interesting things here. This is average donation and percentage of income that's being given away. What we suspect is going on here is that these numbers are being skewed by very, very high donations by a very, very small number of people. There's a particular reason why we think that, and it comes back to when we look at the postcode data. So I'm being given the hurry up. This is the conclusion slide. In terms, I think this is interesting, that if you look at those who are giving the most, and now you cannot conflate these, okay? You can't say it's 45 to 59-year-old females. These are separate categories, right? That's very important. But the highest percentage donating, 45 to 59, women, obviously those income of $1 million or more, and those living in the ACT. So our Canberrans are very, very generous in terms of the number of them who are giving. And that's remained very consistent over the last decade. The average donation has increased in every year except 3 over the 2 decades. So that's a very consistent story. Average donations just keep on going up. The largest average donations, males, those aged over 60, taxable income of $1 million or more. But the interesting story here is around state and territory, and that's where WA completely bucks the trend. Limitations, I'll let you read through that on your own, but I think the important thing is that these are only people who made a donation to a DGR and then claimed it. So there'll be people who gave to charities that were DGRs, and there are people who gave to DGRs and charities and didn't claim it. There are multiple reasons why they could have not claimed, and we don't have any understanding of that. That's the end. I do have, if we come back to it in question time later, there's a bit more data on WA. This is a conference paper, it's a work in progress. We'd love feedback, those are my details. Please tell us where we could do better. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Elizabeth Chan, and she's going to talk about trustee companies, their role in Australian philanthropy.
That's all right, I've got nothing to set up with.
Oh, perfect.
I'm perfect. Nothing to set up with. Just brought my pencil and paper. Many things happening here. But while they're doing that,
So where?
off you go, off you go. Right. I'll just quickly introduce myself and why I'm here today giving this paper. Many of you would know that I've worked in philanthropy for a number of decades. Initially working for foundations that are managed by trustee companies. Then as a decade as Philanthropy Australia, and in 2016 I finished a PhD thesis, sort of thing you do when you've got nothing else to do, because I'm a passionate advocate of public accountability of philanthropy in Australia, and I took as my thesis a little known aspect of philanthropy, most people don't know, that I estimate about 40% of Australia's philanthropic capital is with trustee companies. Now, as I stand here today, I can't tell you the number of foundations we have in Australia, which I think is absurd. I mean, it's only a number, but we don't have it. We've got some data, of course, that Alex has shown us. We have other data that the Centre at QUT has produced, aggregate data about PAPs, and trustee companies tell us that they've got 2,000 foundations, supposedly give away $200 million a year from the income, and they have $3.5 billion or $4 billion of philanthropic capital. Now, who are these 2,000 foundations? What happens to the money that's the income that's given philanthropically? We don't really know. We don't know. In my thesis, 2016, I tried to find out, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. And then I want to tell you about the bit of research I've done for this conference. So let me just say a little quickly about the origins of trustee companies. First one established in Victoria in 1878, and 10 years later in New South Wales, and then they sort of mushroomed a bit. Why were they established? There seem to be two main reasons. A gentleman called William Templeton, who was a magistrate, saw a lot of people come into his court who didn't know what to do with their assets, and he saw a business opportunity and helped establish the first trustee company. A different version, given by the Trustee Association, which no longer exists, is that people went home for very long periods of time in the 19th century, and they wanted someone to manage their money, and so we get trustee companies. Don't know if either of those are true. There are trustee companies in other colonies of England, but none of them have got the rich philanthropic
foundations that we have here. You know, they do all sorts of other things. So that's sort of a tiny bit of history of them. Just the other thing you should know is they're all established by an Act of Parliament. So you couldn't take them over. They couldn't be merged. And so they were very old-fashioned. You know, they were sort of gentlemen for gentlemen, despite ladies being around or even women. They had a reputation for being prudent, respectable, trusted. And I'll just give you a really tiny example. I shouldn't really. But at the first meeting of Perpetual in Sydney, all the gentlemen sitting at the table felt that they had equal rights to become the chair of Perpetual. And then they agreed that what they would do is they'd determine that the man who had the weightiest body mass would be appointed chairman. And then Sir James Reading Fairfax achieved that honour. So you see, governance has changed a bit, but not much else in trustee companies. Okay, so they were personal, they were private, they were confidential, they were reliable, they were dependable, they were respectable. Then in 1983, a Labor government with Paul Keating deregulated the finance market, and off went trustee companies. And all that stuff about not being able to be taken over, looking after people, they just became these behemoths of financial services. And when I started my thesis in 2012, there were 4 big trustee companies. Now, when Keating deregulated, there were 35. There were 35 in 83, so not very, you know, a couple of decades later, got 4. And today you've got 2. And many of you may have seen the reports in the last few weeks about Perpetual being taken over by an equity company. Now, what's that equity company going to care about these 1,000 foundations that Perpetual has? I mean, you know, anyway, we're talking to government about that. So we've now got 2. And because of the ACNC, so I finished my thesis in 2016. What I did, I had 32, a sample of 32. I went and found the wills and probate of 32 people within these trustee companies. And I won't tell you how difficult that was to do. If I hadn't worked in a trustee company, I'd never have been able to do any of it. But anyway, I found 32. So I've got my names, you know. ABC Smith Foundation. I found the will, they tell me what they want. I found how much money they'd left. A friend of mine who's at the Australia Institute, you know, says, well, today it should be worth this and probably should be giving away that. I tried to find any public information about what had happened, where the company is the sole trustee. So remember, I've said they're reliable, they're dependable, they're personable. So these people with no family leave their money in perpetuity in a foundation, and they say to the company, you're all these wonderful, dependable things, you're here in perpetuity, you're there as a, through an Act of Parliament, here's my money, look after it. I told you all about, you know, what happens when Keating comes in. I go looking for any information in 2012 for my 32. Now, where the company is the sole trustee, I found nothing. Nothing. Where they're co-trustees, like Buckland Foundation, Felton and others, you know, Buckland's even had an annual report. I won't say I helped get that on the public record. And the world didn't stop. The Buckland trustees did a full annual report in 2000, and guess what? Nothing happened. World went on. Women became educated and we didn't faint. You know, there's lots of things that people say will happen that don't, it does not happen. So with the ACNC this time, I thought, okay, for this paper, I'll go and have a look and see my 32 again. Let's see what I can find. And so I find, because the AC is there, thank you very much, Anna. So what do I find? I find there I've got my sole trustees, the names, you know, So 6 co-trustees, and we're concentrating on these other ones. So the ACNC goes, you know, ABC Foundation, managed by Perpetual, small grant maker, what do you call that, pie chart? Expenses, grants. Well, initially when I looked at it, I thought, SC doesn't make a mistake. Look at it again. So for so many of these foundations, the people had left from 1904. My thesis just happened to have one in every decade. Just happened, you know, random sample. I couldn't, so got the little wonderful little pie chart. And what does it tell me? It tells me that 100% expenses, no grants, no staff. I think that can't be right. So I go down my list. Oh, that one's not 100%, that one's only 85% expenses, 15% grants. Where grants, what grants, don't know. And so I went. Where there are co-trustees, so co-trustees are, you know, you left the foundation with you know, your best friends or whoever, if you don't have family often, you ask that they be the co-trustees. Now, where you have co-trustees managed by a trustee company, the expenses are 15% or less. And this is now trustee companies who, instead of charging what was always the old-fashioned 5 to 6% of income as a fee, now charge 1.058% of capital as a fee. Now, remember, all these people, all these generous people are dead. They have no advocate. Dare I say that Philanthropy Australia has no interest in pursuing this because, of course, their members are trustee companies, the big two at the moment, never had an interest in it, mainly because the rest of Philanthropy Australia members don't want public accountability, and they really do believe that philanthropy is solely private. Now, philanthropy is not solely private. You get very, 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 very generous in Australia tax benefits. All foundations get franking credits. I've done some research on the top, you know, the Myers, the Potters, the Bucklands, and so on. A third of the actual granting money, not their capital, but the granting money are from franking credits, and they're straight out of our public purse. So philanthropy is not solely private. This debate was held in America 50 years ago. It took about 10 years, but the Congress finally said, no, it's not private, not solely private. You have to tell us who you are, what you do, what your names are, where your money goes, and everyone screamed. And what was interesting for me is that when a very minor bit of public accountability was suggested by the Treasury in 2008, why don't we have contact details for these foundations, for NGOs? And remember, philanthropy is not about the dazzling zeros or the halo. It's about the recipients of the money and how that increases the common good, the NGOs. It's about NGOs and it's about grant making. It's not about whatever the theories are about the wonderful elite philanthropists that we have. We get these extraordinary tax benefits, and I agree with the policy. You know, franking credits, put my hand up. You know, there I was at Philanthropy Australia thinking this was a good idea. So it's not that I don't agree with the generous tax benefits. I just want some public accountability. How can it be that these generous dead people who thought they were leaving money to enhance the common good, whether it was to help women and children, you know, whatever it might have been for, why don't we know? Why don't we know their names? Why haven't any of you who work for NGOs, why haven't we got a list of them on Perpetual's website or Equity's website? that says, you know, this is what they do. I mean, simple things, you know, ring this person or let's inquire if you might be eligible. We don't have anything. I mean, I think it's sort of ridiculous. So I'm going to continue with these figures. When Anna gets back to Melbourne and Sue Woodward's got her feet under the desk, Sue Woodward, by the way, has been hearing about this forever. I'm just going to say, well, what do we do? I've talked to Andrew Lee about it. I think with the new government, you know, we're not asking for much. And as I started to say about America, in America, Congress said, no, you've got to tell us who you are. 50 years later, in Australia, Liz goes to this 2008 Treasury inquiry into PAPS. And I look at why philanthropists don't want the most minimal form of public accountability, a contact number, so you can apply for a grant. And guess what? All the philanthropists, contemporary ones, that, you know, the founders of PAPS, they say, no way. We don't want to give them our contact numbers. And the other four, the reasons they gave are exactly the same reasons that the American philanthropists gave 50 years ago. Isn't that funny? So it's not about anything but power. It's about power. Same reasons here in Australia, 50 years later, from philanthropists who go, no, we're not going to give anyone our contact details. Now, I've worked in government. Usually when Treasury puts out a discussion paper, you can bet your life that's what's going to happen. But they fought. They're very powerful. Philanthropists have power, influence and money. And they do believe, we've never had the debate here, we've never had the debate about, is this money solely private? And if you have that debate, I think you come to where the American Congress came, which is, no, we account for public monies. You can still do what you want. You know, it's your money. In that sense, it's an amalgam of money. It's very unique money. But you go off and do what you want. Just tell us, you know, we spent that much, we gave it to this lot of people. Tell us a bit. Tell us that you don't want our applications and we won't send them. So this is not just about an academic paper. This is about changing the law. So next conference, we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for finishing on time. And that was a really nice way of finishing off today's presentation, Liz. So over to you guys for questions. Yes, please.
Elizabeth, did you not find that once there was a reporting regime with the ACNC, that each of those trusts had to register as an entity and the information started to flow? You saw some of it. Was it inadequate?
I think inadequate. And the thing is, you see, Murray, what I don't know, all I've got is my 32. I've got the names of the 32. What about the other sort of 900?
The sift.
Don't know who they are. Don't know how to get them. And, you know, with all this wonderful data that we've, you know, I mean, I know Anna's been working on and others at the ACNC. So if I, as a funder, want to go and find a charity in, you know, Footscray, well, I think your data will really help me do that. But if the Footscray charity of young people wants to find a funder, different question.
Are you familiar with the National Fund case where someone gave £500 million in 1927 to pay off the British debt, but it was to be held until the British debt could be paid off? There was enough money. And no one really knew why this strange gift was made and who made it. We now know 100 years later that it was, in fact, the largest shareholder in the Barclays Bank. The money was held for 100 years. Barclays Bank not only clipped the ticket every year, but their share price floated up on this river of gold. And so strange things can happen in philanthropy.
Indeed. Oh, look, I might have sounded like I was a bit of a critic of philanthropy. I'm not. I just want some reform.
So, I mean, the trustee company fees are legislated.
Yes,
So, and the legislation depends by state. That's true. So we're
not anymore.
it's now the 1.058 or whatever it was. So the ones that you found through the SE register that were reporting 100% expenses and no grants, one can assume that they were not earning more than 1.056%, such that once they'd paid their trustee fee, there was no money left over for grant making. Am I misunderstanding?
Well,
I
it's
don't know.
significant that it's commission plus expenses. And
Right.
if you can load enough clerks, consultants, advisors onto the party,
Yeah.
the expenses are the ones that go up. The commission is pretty hefty in itself,
But isn't it?
and they both float up together to above the income.
I mean, even where there are co-trustees, like Buckland, you know, where I said has an annual report, I mean, because none of them can move, even though all these trustee companies merge, where I said now we've got two, we might end up with one. You can't, there's no portability. So if you're the co-trustee, you and Anna are the co-trustees and the trustee companies there, you can't go to the trustee company and say, we want to move. We don't think you're giving us a good service. You know, we reckon Joe around the corner will do it for nothing. The Buckland trustees tried that. We went to see QC, went to see Alan Myers, and Alan said, cost you $250,000 to $500,000 have to come out of your very personal income because the company won't back this legal claim. So they didn't do it. Their fee went up $500,000 after that. You can't do anything about it, you know, sort of no better service. I mean, when I used to work for Buckland, there was sort of me, Sandra, and then Sandra and Sue Woodruff. I mean, just ridiculous.
There are some judges who might be a supervisor.
Well, of course, I've always had a total fantasy, you know, probably even Alex remembers it, you know, I used to walk around with my great fantasy, take all the money away from trustee companies, put it into, you know, a sort of a community foundation, have prominent people on the board that rotate, get someone to do all the finance for nothing. You know, this is for the community. And all these generous dead people really need their time in the light, I think.
Any more question or anything, comments from anyone? And I've heard your name so many times in the last few minutes. I was wondering whether you had a comment or something to say.
Well, I think it's probably more likely that you thank Murray for all of the reporting rather than me. I just turned up.
So being mindful of time and to allow people time to go to other sessions, I was wondering whether each of the speakers would have any final summary comments or anything about their work.
My plea, even a prayer if I believed in it, is, you know, please God, let's get the public discourse on philanthropy beyond the dazzling zeros and the halo. You know, we need to do this reform. You know, I loved your paper, and I'm always extraordinarily interested in all these figures. But there really is something fundamental here. This money is for the sector has no access to it, they don't know it exists. And I think that's not right.
I just wanted to riposte a comment you made. Maybe you didn't make it quite as emphatically as it sounded.
I probably did.
What you're describing is the kind of dead hand of old white gentlemen from the 19th century. Whereas, you know, what I'm interested in and what I've experienced are living philanthropists who are quite open and quite willing to be transparent about their philanthropy. They're two different categories. I'm not saying all living philanthropists are, but some.
Sure.
So it's not, it's Well, I would
Well,
resist
as I said-
painting all philanthropy with the same brush.
Yeah, well, I did say it was about trustee companies, and I think most people have no idea that there's philanthropy within trustee companies. I mean, I don't know, you know, you might have, but most don't. And the other very interesting thing, John, is someone who's become a friend very recent, well, a colleague, but sort of a friend recently, was a very senior person at Perpetual Investing. And I said to him, how did you treat the charitable trusts, all that philanthropy? He said, oh, never heard about it. Didn't know it was there. Never came across my desk.
I do wonder about the people being open with their philanthropy. Is it they're open about how much they're putting into philanthropy, or open about how much actually goes to philanthropic causes? So you're not quite reformed tax officer, as I am, and the use of PAFs, for instance, in Australia.
I mean, there's a lot of issues that, you know, that could be discussed and probably improved, without a doubt. But I think it also comes back to your point. That's, you know, all of us believe, you know, there needs to be more informed, intelligent discussion about philanthropy. Warts and all, you know, it's good size and bad
Well,
size.
you know, I didn't do a PhD at my, you know, youthful age to really be an academic or do a PhD or anything. I did it so I can take it to Four Corners and go, look, here you are, you know, it's the Four Corners program. Anyway, it took me about 12 months to do that, and then they finally agreed. So they had two big questions right through that 12 months. First one was, what else is written? Who else has written about it? So you've written this, but I mean, you know, we're not going to take your word for it. Who else has written? When there's no public information, you can't write. Academics don't write. And you see that huge change in America after they changed it in '69. Suddenly you get information. Suddenly people start questioning it. Suddenly John can do this, you know, survey of who's written what and what they've written and what they think. Try that here. I mean, there's wonderful data that they you know, there's QUT, but they don't have the information. They've got the data, so they give us the data.
Okay, being mindful of
Yeah,
time.
sorry. Yeah, we'll be here all day. Sorry.
Brilliant. Thank you.
No PowerPoint.
Where are you gonna?
That's not great.
Find out the workshop later.
Yeah, you're not, aren't you, Chair?
Just this is,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Where are we going next?
That was.
I messaged her while sitting next to you. That's all right, we're working on it. I've got.
You staying on as well?
Yeah,
I'm going to stay on as well. Thank you. I know you make sure to take those two.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Diamond exchange.
Sorry, I'm just okay. Thank you. Okay. So, my topic is agency in the third space, developing a participatory art-based intervention for refugee background children. Before I begin, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Wajik people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. My involvement with the NGO sector in Pakistan since 2014 has been in the area of creative intervention planning and implementation. Before I get into the details of my work, I'll just give a brief introduction of the diverse history of the third sector in Pakistan. It's a bit complicated, so I'll just shorten it. This sector has been evolving in response to the rapidly changing social, economic, and political situation in the country. Pakistan's third sector was born at the time of 1947 partition, when India and Pakistan gained independence. A lot of NGOs arose at that time to help in the process and address this crisis. There were millions of displaced refugees. So though not in the shape of formal NGOs yet, many voluntary organizations arose to provide this aid. One such organization, All Pakistan Women Association, among others, set up at the time, continues to play a significant role in responding to this humanitarian crisis. The third sector in Pakistan, it's varied and in size and its involvement as well. And it's basically involved in multidimensional activities at the same time, such as providing education, orphan care, and disaster relief. Their evolution has been influenced or guided by periods of religious philanthropy, political instability and unrest, and military rule or intervention. A major period of growth in these organizations has been observed in the past few years, with an overwhelming number of NGOs sprouting. In a review of the third sector in Pakistan, it was stated that nobody really knows how many NGOs are functioning in Pakistan at this point. Because there's at least for every 2,000 people, there is one NGO. And this review was in 2014. So we don't really know how they're functioning because most of them have been working unregistered as well. This leads to an inadequate dispersal of funds with an overemphasis on some issues while others that require urgent attention, they're being ignored. A friend of mine who was addressing an earthquake crisis after that, she told us that instead of food and everything, they had she just figured out that they have been spending hundreds of, I don't know, dollars on toothpaste and toothbrushes. And she just found out when she went in to check the finance sector herself, because there aren't many people addressing all of these things. Another major challenge is the sustainability of projects. According to Mustafa Talpur, a senior staff member at Oxfam, very few, if any, projects have received ongoing funding to ensure sustainable implementation. At times, projects are repeatedly implemented or left to deteriorate without any continued support. My current project seeks to address this challenge and proposes a program for refugee background children and young people that is sustainable, cost-effective, without much reliance on external aid, and flexible. Before I expand on my proposed research, I will briefly describe the state of refugees in Pakistan. Currently, we're hosting 1.5 million Afghan refugees. And this isn't even the most recent statistics, because since the Taliban takeover in August 2021, we've received even more of these. And more than half of this are children and young people. The legal status of refugees in Pakistan is unclear. largely due to the fact that the only existing law pertaining to immigrants in the country is the Coroner's Order of 1951, which was amended in 2000. That sets out laws for foreigners entering, staying in, or leaving the country, but doesn't have anything to say particularly about refugees. This leads to a lack of support for relevant policies and programs. Although Pakistan was very generous towards refugees when it gained independence, the ever-changing circumstances and the ultimate decline of funding in this area has left very few organizations addressing this issue. At present, they work either independently or in collaborations with UNHCR, which are long-term or short-term projects. Refugees in Pakistan face many challenges. On top of finding the right help among such instability, they are also exposed to distressing events, leading to a negative impact on their mental health. However, studies on the mental health of refugees in Pakistan are limited. There is obviously an undeniable need for sustainable programs and interventions to support their well-being. Refugee children, particularly, go through several adverse events co-occurring with war and displacement. These include traumatic loss, separation, and exposure to domestic and community violence. This can at times lead to a range of mental health issues. However, it should be noted here that not all children are affected the same way, and characteristics such as gender, family, levels of violence experience also determine the impact of war and displacement. Globally, there is now a movement away from the post-traumatic disorder view of trauma, which imposes pathology regardless of individual differences. Instead, there is a call to imagine alternatives of care. The PTSD view of trauma is very individual-centric. There is no doubt it has been important in understanding distress caused by conflict and violence. However, due to its lack of focus on the influence of collective trauma as a whole, a factor that plays a key role in how demographics and social cohesion impact one's response to traumatic situations, a PTSD view becomes insufficient. In response to this call to imagine alternatives of care, arts-based interventions such as drawing and painting are coming up to provide the needed care. While understanding the prevalence of psychopathology in refugee children is essential, it is equally important to develop projects and interventions that will focus on their healthy readjustment. I'm going to quote an example here of a project that is one of the major inspirations behind my current research. Lynne is a researcher working with refugee children in Cape Town, South Africa. She completed her PhD at the African Center for Migration and Society, where her focus was on a creative intervention to understand resettlement and trauma, through an examination of a suitcase project. This project utilized old suitcases across the city to create artworks, basically using the suitcases as canvases. This project was done with unaccompanied refugee children in Johannesburg from 2001 to 2005. It involved 27 children, aged 6 to 18, who had fled political war and conflict. They had made extremely difficult journeys and crossed multiple borders and were residing in inner city Johannesburg at the time. The children were presented with options of several techniques and materials and were allowed to use them the way they wanted. They even selected the suitcase they wanted to work with. They used wax media, printing, drawing, collage work, 3D objects, among others, to create their artworks, both on the inside and the outside of the suitcase. The outside of each suitcase represented their lives at the present, and the inside represented their past. Their artworks also went on to become a vehicle to tell their stories. This would either be done in groups or individually. Children were never asked to speak about their artworks, but only given a choice, and all stories were voluntary. Exhibitions were held at the end, which not only helped raise awareness about the lives of refugee children, but also proved to be therapeutic for them. There is room for progress in Pakistan's third sector, with most organizations recognizing and being very supportive of innovative and sustainable programs. I started my career at a nonprofit for autism education in 2014, using art and photography to achieve emotional and behavioral targets for the students. In 2016 at Shaukat Khanum Cancer Hospital, I worked in the play therapy department, assisting in developing mental health interventions for children in the play therapy room who were undergoing cancer treatment. With simple doodles, I illustrated a culturally adapted story to familiarize them with the treatment and equipment involved in the process to reduce their hospital or treatment-related anxiety. During my MPhil in 2018, I developed an arts-based intervention program for institutionalized children at a Child Protection and Welfare Bureau in rural Rawalpindi. Working with different art techniques, including collage work, painting, and clay modeling, I was able to observe a decrease in the emotional and behavioral problems previously reported in the resident children. For this PhD, I want to explore the role of arts as intervention further. I have been deeply interested in the transdisciplinary nature of the arts and what programs they could lead to for children who have been marginalized. Arts-based research, or ABR for short, is a transdisciplinary research field existing at the intersection of art and science. ABR basically integrates creative arts into the research context. When working with children, it is important to ensure that the rights of equal participation are not overlooked. Participatory arts-based research, a form of ABR, helps preserve this right by setting an approach where the participants of a study are treated as collaborators or co-researchers. This means they have an equal say in the research process from start to end. This in itself is a very empowering act for a child. In this study, I will be exploring PABR as an intervention for refugee background children in resettlement. I will be looking at this approach through the lens of the third space theory. The unique experiences of refugee background children need to be considered as a major influence in shaping their identities and sense of self. The third space theory facilitates this by providing the idea or concept of an in-between space where creative forms of cultural identity can be produced. This holds importance in the context of refugee background children in resettlement, where they're navigating a new understanding of their lives impacted by the transition from their home countries to their host countries. I will be using two art techniques, mapping and collage work, to rebuild a sense of agency and meaning making. This intervention will be delivered in the form of 10 arts-based workshops at an identified public school in Perth in the start of next year, following all ethical approvals. The artworks obtained will be treated as data along with the accompanied field notes, which I'll be analyzing to understand their experience. Evidence shows that creative interventions can help refugee children make meaning of their distress and make a statement about their advocacy. This is a deeply empowering act where in most cases these children become the marginalized victims and have little say in the decisions being made for them. Currently, refugee organizations are seeking creative initiatives for children that can be adapted and implemented requiring little resources, especially in countries like my home country, Pakistan, that is hosting 1.5 million refugees and has very few resources. Being a mobile and adaptable form of intervention, not necessarily requiring clinical psychologists or art therapists, this intervention could prove beneficial as a form of psychosocial and community support program, applicable across settings by a range of professionals. On completion of this research, I plan to disseminate this model to relevant organizations. Most organizations such as Alive Pakistan have teacher training and education programs. The flexibility of this model allows it to be incorporated into existing programs that can be adopted by social workers, art educators, and other professionals, thus increasing its applicability and utility, hence proving greater opportunities and providing greater opportunities for support for refugee children and young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
you. Really interesting presentation. As I said, we'll leave the questions to Leanne because I think all the presentations will have a lot of synergy and points that go together. So our next presenter is Leanne. Is it three?
Three.
Yeah, three?
Not right.
That's fine. Okay. So you're all set.
Hi, everybody. I'm representing quite a big group of researchers that have been put into this project. And most of us are health promotion researchers from Telethon Kids Institute, and some are artists who are also researchers from ECU. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And I'll also wish to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. And at Telethon Kids, we are always seeking their wisdom in our work to improve the health of children and young people. So the arts and mental wellbeing has become quite a sort of evolving area of research recently. And I think it's mainly because we've come to realise that we have to tackle the problem of mental health in a much more sort of creative and holistic manner. So this has seen quite a lot of studies come out that have actually highlighted the link between mental health and the arts, and have noticed specific interventions that have strengthened both mental and physical health outcomes. In one such area that's been receiving quite a lot of attraction has been that of social prescribing. And this works in that people in the medical profession will refer patients to a social activity, quite often an arts activity, knowing that the outcomes will really be positive for their physical and mental well-being. And an example of that is arts on prescription. But it's not really known exactly how the arts actually improves mental health. It's known that there are, the opportunities for emotional expression and emotional regulation, and stress reduction. And obviously these are really important for positive mental health. They know about the social interaction that occurs during arts activities, which reduces loneliness, which is really important in terms of positive mental health. And it also is recognised that the social interaction can reduce discrimination, which is also really important in terms of positive mental health. But the research in those areas is still quite limited. We, as researchers in the health promotion team at Telethon Kids, are really interested in promoting and preventing mental health, because we recognise that most of the mental health care resources are allocated to acute care in Australia in the hospital services, rather than to protecting and preventing mental health problems and promoting wellbeing. And we really want to balance that out. So we responded to a tender that was put out by Healthway to see how the arts organisations could be supported to promote the mental health of all children and young people through their programs, knowing that they do that innately, but also wanting to support them to do that. So we responded with knowing that we wanted to work with the concept of social emotional wellbeing rather than mental health, because mental health has a lot of negative connotations. Social emotional wellbeing is a much more holistic and promotional way of looking at mental health. We wanted to work from the ground up because we know that arts organisations are already doing a lot of really great things in that space. We didn't want to come along with a top-down sort of way of working. And we wanted to work across the arts and the visual arts, drama, music, dance, circus, and any others that cut across those. So we developed this project called the So Arts Project to enhance the capacity of arts organisations, community arts organisations, to promote the social and emotional wellbeing of young people through their programs. And we had three parts to it. We wanted to develop a draft resource. We didn't really know what that was going to look like. We wanted to pilot it with a few organisations and then trial it to see how it worked in terms of the aim of the project. So in the part one, our objectives were to identify how the social emotional wellbeing of young people is impacted through the arts, and identify how young people's social emotional wellbeing could be further enhanced through the arts. And then we wanted to develop a framework for a draft resource based on this. So I did a variety of different ways of collecting data. We had a workshop with 18 arts organisations, focus groups with young people that were involved in arts organisation programs, and focus groups with parents of kids that were involved. We had input from psychologists, one that was an artist that was working as a clinical psychologist, and others that was clinical psychologists. And we had consultation with an advisory group, and the advisory group was made up of people in the arts in WA. So with the workshop with the arts personnel, we asked them, well, how do you currently promote the social emotional wellbeing of the children and adolescents who come to your programs, and what support would you like to further to be able to do this? We decided to use not just our qualitative methods that we generally use, and use a range, because we knew that the arts people would like to move and be expressive in the way that they presented the data. So we had a tableau exercises, which is actually like developing a freeze frame of what social emotional good or promoting social emotional wellbeing would look like in a group. We had some focus group discussions, and we had light box activities where they developed a visual representation of what social emotional wellbeing looked like in activities using found natural objects and sand. And then we analysed that data thematically, and we found that actually arts organisations that in the community are doing lots of really fantastic things in terms of promoting social emotional wellbeing. They're providing this sort of learning environment quite often that is culturally appropriate. They're thinking about being student-centred, having a psychologically safe environment, allowing for time for reflection. They've got all the really great pedagogies that really do promote social emotional wellbeing, and specific strategies that work in circles. They have mental health warm-ups and cool-downs, and they've got lots of really great things happening. But what they really needed was support along that horizontal line there, organisational support from the top down, from their organisation. They obviously needed funding and resources. They wanted trust in their ability. And they wanted social emotional wellbeing to be a priority along with their artistic outcomes. And they needed professional development around this, and they needed help with the evaluation, which they're always, sort of finding that difficult to be able to evaluate what they do. And they felt they needed access to research. They also wanted a lot more collaboration with other organisations and with the community. We used that and to develop part of the resource, which I'll talk about in a second. Then we conducted focus groups with young people and parents. We said, you know, how does being involved in the arts affect your social emotional well-being? Well, we didn't quite say it like that. We just said, how does it, you know, make you feel being involved in the arts? And what do you think, you know, young people need in order to have really good social emotional well-being or feel good about themselves? And they said a lot of really spot on things, as they always do, young people. And they said that in many cases, the arts did a lot, made them feel really good. You know, no one has prior expectations of what you need to live up to. Therefore, you'll be able to be yourself. That's the beauty of the arts. We don't have to worry about getting it wrong, and you can get better at the arts, but there's no right or wrong way to do things. And there's examples about how you step into a character and learn how to be empathetic, and learn how to sort of develop passion about things. These are just examples of some of the things that they said. And when we analysed the data, we thought, well, there's two big areas that young people say that they need and quite often get from the arts in order to feel good. And that's the opportunity to be yourself and to connect with other people. And I think they're pretty fundamental, those two things really. And then there were sub-themes from being myself, or being able to develop a bit of awareness about myself, being in the zone, feeling safe, managing pressure, doing what I love to do or what I value, and developing self-compassion, and having positive peer comparison instead of competition constantly, relatable teachers, helping others and understanding others better. And they found that generally in the arts that they were the teachers worked in a student-centred way. They gave them the opportunity to explore issues and in an individualised way. And they also weren't very stereotyped, although there was differences obviously across the arts with those. So we thought, okay, we'll use this as a framework. We know lots of really good things are happening, not necessarily across all the arts, but this can be a framework for the resource. And arts can work using this framework to explicitly say and be able to talk about what they do in relation to mental health. So we developed an organisational tool called the Map the Gap tool, just for them to see where they sat in terms of a lot of organisational aspects. And then we developed what we called wellbeing factors, which were related to those being myself and connecting with others that the young people had said. The Map the Gap tool, included things like about leadership and culture and policy and practice and professional learning, and it was a tool for them to map where they were in relation to those in terms of social emotional wellbeing. And then that tool will accumulate ideas from arts organisations for them to help to move along the continuum. And then the wellbeing factors were for the teaching artists. And we used working with a psychologist to pull out from the evidence some of the key messages that need to be portrayed through the art sessions in order to help young people understand and be able to talk about their own mental health or the way they feel. So then we piloted the resource with two organisations, a dance and a theatre organisation, to evaluate the acceptability and feasibility of the resource. And we then we collected data, quite a bit of data on the way through to see, as a survey, we observed and watched some of the sessions, and then conducted interviews with teaching artists. And we found that they actually thought the resource, the wellbeing factors were really useful, and they could verbalise what they were doing. They were doing a lot of those the things that that were indicated in the wellbeing factors, but in other cases they weren't, and they wanted to use that to sort of focus in on some of the social emotional wellbeing factors. They wanted to access some further research. And also they wanted information about how to cope with pointy end issues when there was problems in the class. So we're now into the part 3 of this project, which has got taken like 2 years. We have 23 community arts organisations implementing the resource in their programs in a variety of different ways. So there's regional, remote and metropolitan arts organisations that are involved. And this is just a range of some the organisations that are currently involved. We've developed a website to help guide the arts organisations to give them the background research that they wanted and to help them get some ideas in terms of evaluation. Now we're just thinking, well, where to now? We know that the arts does a lot of really promising things in terms of social emotional wellbeing. And what we hope is this resource will just highlight to the rest of the community in terms of what they actually do. And then we together with the arts organisations, will promote the work of, in the community in terms of how they affect not only arts outcomes, but also mental health outcomes. We're thinking along the lines of providing some accreditation of organisations that implement the resource, if that's something that they feel they want. And we'll develop the draft resource further as they use it and implement it and provide feedback. So that's where we're up to now, and we have further funding to do more and to develop the resource and the support for the arts organisations in the coming year. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Now, last presentation in this session today, Keevers. Sorry, Keevers. My writing there. Read my own writing.
Thank you. Very great. So it's done. Very good.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to the presentation. I just want to acknowledge that Samantha Ushi, she's gone. Thought she was there, but maybe she's not. I just want to.
I am here, Lynne.
Thanks, Dan. So first of all, I'll just also do an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the traditional owners, the Whadjuk people of Noongar country, which I'm talking from for you today, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people here with us face to face or virtually. I acknowledge the land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Youth homelessness is a significant and growing phenomenon in Australia, which I'm sure you all know, and how communities and organisations, businesses and governments work collaboratively to provide integrated responses to young people living in difficult situations with multiple needs beyond housing is critical to their well-being, their health and their capacity to live the life that matters to them. So there are structural barriers to achieving positive outcomes for young people. The level of income support while they complete education or until they get a secure job is not enough that they can even pay rent. And the lack of investment in affordable, long-term affordable housing is another structural barrier to enabling hope and opportunities for young people experiencing homelessness. In the homelessness space, outcomes-based performance management and evidence-based practice are like the order of the day. And the current policy settings from funders endorse case-managed, well, rapid rehousing first, and then wraparound case management support for up to 18 months. And this presentation comes out of a larger project which investigates the practices that are effective in assisting young people exit or avoid homelessness. And the organisation, Southern Youth and Family Services, I'll call them Southern Youth for short, they were interested to find out, they do a lot of stuff that's beyond what they're funded for. Lots of creative workshops, events, celebrations and rituals. And they were keen to know, well, what work was this doing? Because it's seen as kind of frivolous or icing on the cake or off to the side. And so this is a work in progress, definitely. And so I'm really keen to get your feedback. And the presentation doesn't examine the endorsed case management response, but investigates the impacts of those events, celebrations, creative workshops. And these events intervene in the lives of young people involved with Southern Youth beyond the individualising and instrumentalist case management approach. The events can be understood as social, political, spiritual, therapeutic practices. And they're quite different to the dominant approaches which focus on individual behaviour and cognition. So we argue, or I'm going to argue in this presentation, that organising practices like the events, the creative workshops and the celebrations create conditions of possibility for disadvantaged young people, and that these events are characterised by non-individualistic, non-pathologising, collective and a communal approach, and they contribute to practising social justice and practising care. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'll just introduce SIFs, talk briefly about the theoretical frame and the methods. I'll give a couple of examples of the events and creative workshops, show how they represent organising practices of social justice and care, and how they're collective and therapeutic, and talk a little bit about the implications for policy and practice. So who is SIFs? Well, they're the Third Sector Conference, so they're a community-based not-for-profit. They operate an integrated model for homeless, at-risk and disadvantaged young people and their families. They operate more than 40 services across eastern and southern New South Wales, and they are managed by a board, a voluntary board, and they do actually have an international reputation for a provider of excellent youth services. The research methodology was used practice theory and employed collaborative inquiry. It was conducted in 4 phases, but this presentation is just about the 3rd phase. And the research question for this phase was, what are the impacts of collective practices such as events, rituals and celebrations on young people who are disadvantaged, homeless or at risk of homelessness? The study is guided by a relational ontology. So it views that it is within situated practices that we, the young people, practitioners and researchers, co-emerge and define each other. So existence is not an individual affair. Like as Donna Haraway would remind us, to become one is always to become many. So this suggests that that to investigate what is effective in these rituals and creative workshops, we have to go beyond the individual young person and the individual practitioner, and we have to focus on the collective. So the practitioners, the young service participants, the community members, the technologies, the food, the music, country. So with this methodology, we focused on, we did one of the key methods I'll talk about in a minute was observation. And so we look at what are people doing? What are they saying? How are they relating? What are the material and spiritual arrangements? And so to identify the practices, we zoomed in on these sayings, doings, relatings, and spiritual and material arrangements that we observed and that were obvious in the interviews. And then we zoomed out to the broader social, political arrangements and practices. I won't go through this in any detail because I'll probably run out of time, but here is the data gathering, and this part of the study is just the qualitative, data concentrate on. So when social justice is the driving force, according to Southern Youth, behind what they do, and in our broader project, we looked at notions of social justice, and it's obviously a very amorphous concept, and there's a range of competing views about social justice. We were particularly interested in those that go beyond the material aspects, the redistributive aspects of social justice, and reflected the relationality, the respect, the care, the belonging, and the overcoming hardship that was evident in the fieldwork. So we, looked at some of the theorists like Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser, Iris Marion Young. But in all these approaches to social justice, they're end state orientated. They're looking at a telos, and they're universal in their intent. And social justice is conceived as like underpinning values or principles, or something to be evaluated, goals to be evaluated against. And the actual doing, the practicing of social justice is overlooked. Sorry about the complex diagram. So, but this diagram, it represents an overview of the practices that we identified at CIFS, and it includes the creative workshops and the rituals and celebrations. And you'll notice that they are right in the middle of the intersection between practices of respect and recognition, representation and participation, social inclusion, and redistribution. And in this framework of doing social justice, it's a dynamic of enfolded practices of those 4 elements. And then the practices, the little practices written, it's not like it's really inadequate, the diagram, because it looks atomistic, but they're creating these dimensions, and the dimensions are also creating the practices. So they're enfolded with one another. Yeah, and so this framework, the possibility, the meaning, the matter of social justice is constantly open and indeterminate. And the possibilities and the impossibilities for living justly are made and remade in engagement with one another. So what is included in the enactment of the world brings forth a different world. It becomes differently, if that makes sense. The colours represent CIFS as well, and it's linked to the broader social movements that it's part of. Red for the labour movement, purple and green for feminism, green for environmental movement, and white for peace, all of which Southern Youth is actively involved in. So within that framework, I want to give you a couple of examples of the events. I've just picked 2. They're both annual ones. One is an annual week-long music workshop, and one is the annual awards night. There's many, many more that they engage in. So the first one I'm going to mention is a week-long music workshop that's held every year, and it's key that they're regular, not one-offs, and it's led by Shelley Morris, a First Nations woman, a singer of high regard and standing, she speaks, I think, 17 First Nation languages, and she has been conducting these workshops with Southern Youth for 17 years. And her workshops they create an effective atmosphere that brings forth a really strong sense of togetherness and bonding between the participants and the facilitators as they share storytelling and make music together. The workshop involves composing and producing songs. All of the participants go away with at the end of the week, they go to a professional recording studio, and each young person takes away a recording of their own songs. At the same time, the young people collectively write a song, and that song is on a theme important to them. It's usually, well, I've witnessed, I don't know, lots of them, but at least 7 or 8 songs, and they usually have a strong political focus about being young and how they want the world to be. And they perform that at the awards night, which I'm going to talk about at the moment. Yeah, this is just part of our observations. There's musical instruments strewn everywhere, tables where people work, etc. It's quite intense, these workshops. There's a lot of feeling to manage, it makes and opens the participants up to lots of possibilities, which I'll talk about in a minute. The awards night is an annual thing. It's a ceremony that publicly recognises the achievements of young people engaged with Southern Youth. So throughout the year, they identify young people for particular awards, and they nominate them, and then a committee of external people, including some politicians, work out the awards. They can be things like getting your driver's licence, or completing a course, or reconnecting with your family, all sorts of different things. These awards, usually about 300 people attend. It's very glitzy. All the young people get dressed up, families come. Usually every state and federal member is there. Usually the minister's there. Yeah, they're big events. And on that night, there's an abundance of food and drink and mingling. And that's the event where the young people perform their song that they've written in the week before with everyone. Okay, so hopefully that gives a little bit of a flavour. It's very important that these events and celebrations and creative workshops are linked together. And it's very important that they recur. That's key to some of their impact. So in terms of the practices of social justice, I'm just going to mention a couple of them, but I think creating the sense of belonging is really important. You can see from the two quotes there that the events foster horizontal relationships between peers, but they also blur the boundaries between worker and young person. As that bottom quote says, you just have a discussion, you're sitting at dinner, you just have a normal discussion with everybody and also with the workers. You get to know them as people, I reckon, not just as your support workers. That dinner is before going to see a play, another event that I'm not going to talk about. And this, these practices of belonging and inclusion, the events and the celebrations and the workshops, they embody a form of community through which the young people, the board, the families and the volunteers experience a sense of belonging and a sense of connectedness. And this belonging, welcoming culture is integral both to the positive outcomes that the SIFS facilitates in the lives of young people and their families, and also the broader social impacts that SIFS has on the broader community. Practices of care, I'll mention briefly. So these they enact fun, these events. They enable young people to experience what they call normal life. They make it safe for them. You know, young people with social anxiety might be terrified to go to the theatre, but between the workers and the other young people there, they hold them and go with them and they do it. They create a sense of possibility, a sense of hope. It's like they give young people a glimpse into a life that's possible for them that they haven't considered before. And the other thing about care is that it's incredibly socio-material. It's full of stuff. It's full of clothes and food and music, and all these things hold the care, the tickets. And so this view of care, like, it's really different to the dominant view of care as a dyadic relationship between the carer and the cared for. You know, like between a social worker and a client, or a doctor and a nurse. And in this view of care, care is a knowledgeable doing. It is caring and ongoing, sophisticated, collective, spiritual, socio-material accomplishment. One thing I want to mention, young people, we weren't expecting this. When we talked to them about what it was about these events, they all talked, well, quite a lot of them talked about time and how their life was kind of soupy and hard to grab onto in the past, and how these events and participation in the creative workshops were time full and they made memories. And you can see that from the quotes there. And this making of memories and making of moments was very linked to the therapeutic. And the events were as well, because they were witnessed by hundreds of people, rather than just between the therapist and the young person in out-of-home care. So, just to sum up, these were the significant practices in the events, facilitating the horizontal relationships between users, service users, belonging, engaging in activities that weren't about providing a service, creating opportunities to participate and take social action, creating a sense of hope for the future and agency, and creating memories and timeful moments. I'm not going to have time to do that.
To our three presenters today, Zoya, Leanne and Lynne. So we have got time for questions, which I'm sure there's quite a few around the room. If anyone wants to start off.
Sorry, thank you. I just, you conducted research in Pakistan, which areas mostly?
My MP research was in Rawalpindi. So it was at a Child Protection Bureau Welfare Center in rural Rawalpindi. And the other parts were basically my job as well. That was in Lahore, Oasis School for Autism. That's a center for specialized for autism care. And then this hospital was Shafik Khanum, which is also in Lahore, not the Karachi branch. It was way before that.
That's very good, you know, because I have worked with the refugees in Pakistan.
Oh.
I have worked in the USAID as a link between the government and the USAID. I'm an anthropologist.
Oh.
And I worked in the Murray
different villages, Osia, Deval, Upper Deval, and the villages of the Punjab near Rawalpindi. And we saw the refugee effect on the parents and a lot of violence. And the absence of father, husband, and the changing role of women in the rural community. It was by the ministry, and from my department, I did this, and I had a lot of experience, especially in the domestic violence, the House of Destitute Women. This research was by Fulbright Professor Dr. James Green from Washington. So every case, there were the three-way. The research was done in the House of Destitute Women and in the medical psychological ward and with the police.
Okay.
So it's I'm just reminding all the staff you told me that how I did. Even I have gone to the border of Afghanistan and Peshawar, very risky and dangerous, you know.
Yeah.
So and the people in the caves developers, how they treat the children. Sometime, you know, there is the group. They just kidnap the children, you know, because the children they are so upset with the parents, they run away from the house.
Yeah.
And they were taking them to the Gujarat area somewhere. They were just cutting their hands.
Oh,
They were making them disabled. You know, what they do, the edge of the pitcher, they put in their head to make the head small. So later on, they can do the begging profession, you know. So it's very tragic, you know. Yeah, I understand. So thank you. It's very good discussion.
I'd love to know more about your work, though.
Yeah, you know, that's what I'm just telling you.
I think we might want to connect over morning tea or afternoon tea. So then we've got one.
I just want to thank all three of you. I think it's just so uplifting hearing that the arts is being used in this way. You know, for years in philanthropy, we tried to try and change government policy around welfare to say, you know, crudely culture is the best form of welfare because we had so many examples of it and it sort of got nowhere. But it's wonderful to see that there's new research. I mean, there's a lot of it in Melbourne. People in theatre going into women's prisons, you know, prisoners who've never ever done anything except fail. And, you know, then they stay with them when they come out. They often, in the theatre, they stay with them for at least 3 years and then they go off and, you know, we don't sort of really see them again. I mean, it's almost 100% success. Takes a while, but I think it's so powerful. And these are people who've often just failed at everything. And the woman who started this theatre group 30 years ago, she says, you know, you start by teaching them how to breathe. They've never had deep breaths. It's all shallow, it's all trauma, it's all traumatized. So it's just wonderful to hear the three presentations. Thank you. Three of you.
I think, though, Liz, it points to that these are not innocent interventions. They have the potential to be risky and dangerous because at SIFs they have to scaffold them right through the organisation, because what happens if you're a young person who doesn't get nominated for a prize? What happens if you're a young person who isn't able to go out to dinner and then to theatre for whatever reason? Like, there has to be other things made available for them that are equally celebratory, but if you don't do that, it could be quite negative.
Yeah, well, I'm just given I came from philanthropy, we were sort of funding it rather and just interested in what happened over a 3-year period. And then what I was doing was lobbying to see if we could change the practice, because I think, you know, artists need the money, it works, and we just need a whole new approach to what we see as welfare anyway, it seems to me. You know, the inequality is getting worse, the homelessness, as you said, you know, I mean, all these, nothing is improving.
Yeah.
And if you keep doing the same thing round and round, I mean, it's sort of madness. And surely we could, through national policy, try something new. And if there's all this research now, current, I'd be having a good look at it.
And have you seen the Sydney Darling Harbour, how many homeless people are? Even the Unity Grammar School, the children, they go, they are doing some project with them, we deliver the food, you know. So these are the things, you know.
Okay, we've got quite a few other questions.
Lynne, just a really quick question. How are the young people referred to SIFs? Are they only in foster care or are they from other families?
No, they're a whole range. They do have children in out of home care. So people leaving care from DCJ and, you know, they do have those individually funded young people, but also young people are referred by other young people. They have drop-in services where young people come, families, schools. Yeah, it's a whole range. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed all three. Took me back to an earlier part of my life when I was involved in working with children in creative arts. But the thing that kind of I'm curious about, and I don't know whether there are extant studies or whether in your work you have envisaged the possibility of doing any kind of longitudinal study on the effects of these young people having had these creative experiences, because that, you know, I'm just partly reflecting back on my life work in youth theatre, and then it's a long time ago, and I have no idea how some of those wonderful kids actually went on through their lives, and whether the opportunities they had, and you know, whether the way I saw them develop actually continued.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We'd love to do research like that. I mean, it's not funded generally to do, you know, 5-year research or whatever, but we have often thought, and the arts organisation has said the same, that they'd love to see, you know, follow.
Anything elsewhere where they've done some longitudinal?
Yeah, the project that I quoted here, the one that happened in Cape Town, that was a 5-year study, and she's still in touch with most of the children or young people now that are present at Johannesburg. And I actually spoke to her before as well when I was setting up my proposal and everything, and she told me a few things about the kids now and where they are. And she says that they are interested in doing more projects with them.
Yeah.
And some kids have actually mentioned that they want to take the suitcases that they made, they still have them, and they want to take them elsewhere now, and they have plans of immigrating or applying to other countries, you know, or starting a new life or whatever. But yeah, she had a lot of she had done a lot of projects that were longitudinal as well.
Fascinating to do.
So we haven't done longitudinal studies in relation to the events, or even in relation to the practices that are effective, but we have done ex-clients of SIFs. At 3 years, 5 years, 10 years.
I suppose. I mean, that's what that's part of the concept I had.
But we didn't follow them. That was just the current ones and then the past ones, and not about the events and the rituals, but certainly that showed significant improvements in housing stability. They didn't go on to adult homelessness, which is usually predicted.
Yeah.
Quotes from ex-clients saying that they hadn't been back to a psych ward since, you know, like definite, you know, big shifts, like statistically significant shifts, but not in relation, never. And we haven't got money for longitudinal, which is what's really needed. Yeah, and certainly not around these events and rituals and celebrations.
Can you ask one question? Have you involved young people and children with disability in these programs?
So there are young people with disability, mainly though autism, not so many young people with physical disability. There's large percentage, well, 25% Aboriginal young people, and a small number of refugees, like mainly from Africa and from Syria, but which just reflects the population of the service. Yeah.
I would just make a comment that in Western Sydney, down in Campbelltown, there's a school there, and they run they put on a theatre, which set up a theatre for children with refugee backgrounds. And I just went along to this about a month ago, and they put on a performance at the Seymour Centre at the end of it, and they tell their own stories about what life was like and where they came from, and then they tell the story of where they are now, what their hopes are for the future. It was quite very emotionally moving, because you can see like how would you live through some of the things that these young people live through. Just have so much respect for where they've come. And their parents and families are in the audience as well. And, you know, they're handing out tissues and things like that. It was just, it was great. But a real sense of empowerment and taking charge of their life. But they had that thing you're talking about, longitudinal. It's been going for about 10 years, I think. But they had former students come back who'd gone into the workforce or left 5 to 10 years ago. And they'd say what they were doing now. Those sorts of things. Whereas the children or the kids who were in the performance, they would say what are their hopes for the future, what would they like to do for work and things. So,
Is it the Performance Arts School, Campbelltown?
I don't think so. Sorry, I just can't remember it. A friend took me along.
Is that the main? Yeah, because I live in Campbelltown.
Yeah, well, I can. Peter Harcher is the patron.
And do you know the Zambar Caster, the Jewish leader?
Yeah.
They are doing interfaith program in all schools. The Muslims, Catholic, Christian children, they like him. And even with the coordination of the other principals, they are running very good program.
Okay. I'm interested in how that celebration, sharing, community aspect of helping young people at risk. Like I'm thinking of my nephew who has many problems from poverty, and he had been homeless and drug and alcohol, gambling addictions, and he needs a lot of help. I've talked to so many people who just cut people that are out of their family because they can't deal with the helplessness or being abused, I suppose, by that person. And our family so far managed to keep him in the fold and always make sure he comes to family celebrations and everything like that. And I just wonder how those principles that apply in that organisation could perhaps be spread and to help families who have family members with issues, because there's a lot of times that my mum and myself and my sister have all found that there's just like, what can you do? There's nothing you can do. But if we could understand the benefits of making sure people feel included in the family, and I think that would be a really beneficial.
Yeah, I think in relation to Southern Youth, they originally worked with homeless young people. And then over the years, they've increasingly worked with families and issues like child to parent violence. And certainly they put a lot of effort into restoration. And the families are actually included in all these, events, and well, not all of them, but quite a lot of them, especially the sporting ones and the awards nights.
And let's say you
stuff.
don't have access to such a fantastic organisation. What can family, for me, we look around, there's nothing for him. He's 34 years old now.
It's very difficult.
Yeah, there's nothing out there. But what can we do? That's what I'm asking. What can we do?
Can you take her to community leader or the councillor? Yeah, have you done that?
Yeah, I think that if that SIFs would say that those things about respect and recognition, and always people work to preserve their dignity and to maximise their safety, and always keeping